Chapter 19, Methods of Mass Production and Destruction, Technological Systems, 1914 to 1937. And this could just as easily be called World War I, because that's what we'll be talking about in this chapter. So starting with technology in the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution had changed the way people lived their lives. The neighborhood, the factory, the workplaces all experienced rapid development. And industrial ties actually linked nations together in a way that was unprecedented, and it spurred technological and eventually military competition that would result in World War I. So looking at technology in the 20th century, starting with transportation and communication, people had unprecedented mobility. It meant that people could get further distances in shorter amounts of time. So it made the world's most distant places accessible. There were commuter trains, there were subways that had faster speeds and less waiting times. Some urban workers who could afford it even lived in the suburbs because they knew they could take a bus into the city. In 1913, of course, with the assembly line, Henry Ford was producing 30,000 cars a year, and this made the car inexpensive and practical for a mass market. And again, Henry Ford didn't invent the car, he invented the mass-produced car. In 1904, commercial bus operations began in cities. This created the need for more and better roads, which provided jobs for more people. It also spurred other mass industries for the vehicle, like rubber, glass, steel, electrical systems. All of these were needed to build cars. In 1903, the Wright brothers proved that air flight was possible. And by 1914, airplanes could travel at 70 miles per hour, and they were almost immediately used by the military. The ship design was improved. The Lusitania, for instance, which was sunk by a German U-boat, crossed the Atlantic in 5 days, which was really remarkable for the time. In 1901, instantaneously radio telegraphy across the Atlantic became possible, and in the next year it was possible across the Pacific. That meant that people could communicate between the United States and Great Britain instantly. In terms of urban life, cities began to have electrical streetlights for the first time. This allowed factories to operate 24 hours a day. They used alternating current or AC current instead of DC current or direct current, and this allowed electricity to be carried over long distances. This also meant that factories were no longer tied to waterfront locations. Because of electricity, they could be pretty much anywhere. The mechanization of agriculture, that drove people off the farms and into the cities. You didn't need mass labor anymore or hundreds of people to work a farm because you had machines to do it. So people left their agricultural jobs as they were replaced by machines and moved into cities for factory jobs. Urbanization, this is the building up of a city. Urbanization and industry went hand in hand. Some people found city life disorienting. They hated it. Others found it exciting because there were movie theaters and department stores and dance halls and things like that. But again, some people didn't like all of that movement, the smog, industry everywhere. But that really just depended on the person. Technology and gender relations. So changes in technology precipitated changes in gender roles. Women's jobs in the home actually became easier because new household appliances were available, like vacuum cleaners and microwaves and stoves, and all of those modern appliances made it a lot easier for women to do housework, giving them more leisure time. Automobiles gave teenagers a chance to explore sexuality away from home by dating instead of making calls. Previous to dating, teenagers made calls. They would sit on the front porch with the parents nearby or out on the deck with them, and they would play cards, they would talk, but it was more of a group thing. But with automobiles, teenagers went off-site, away from home. Kind of hand in hand with that was Margaret Sanger. She was a proponent of birth control in New York, who advocated family planning and distributed birth control information. And she wasn't distributing that to teenagers. She actually was encouraged to distribute birth control materials because she was working in a place where women would come in and they would seem overburdened by lots and lots of children. So she thought they needed to know about birth control. She's actually the founder of Planned Parenthood as well. But she was arrested for being a public nuisance for distributing obscene materials. Congress had passed the Comstock Law, which prohibited obscene literature, and her birth control materials were considered obscene, so she was thrown in jail. Scientific research and development. The educational facilities during this time multiplied, research labs were set up, institutes for scientific advances were created. There was a revolution in chemistry that multiplied productivity in agriculture and industry, changing the way food was produced, changing the way clothing was produced. Synthetic dyes and cloths were produced, and with those synthetic materials also poisonous gases and explosives and fertilizers, and that was all a result of chemistry, pretty much. Albert Einstein published his theory of relativity, which changed the way we look at the world. He said that the only constant is the speed of light, and other than that, time and motion are completely relative to the observer or to the person. That's why if you're at a social event for an hour, it seems a lot shorter than if you're sitting in the classroom for an hour, because he said time and motion are relative to the observer. He also set forth a principle that mass and energy are interchangeable with E equals mc squared, and that concept is what led to the atomic bomb. In 1916, Einstein gave a new theory, the theory of gravity, that overturned Newtonian physics. And he said that physical masses do not attract other physical masses. Rather, they actually bend space toward themselves so that objects roll toward them. Now, scientifically speaking, I don't know what that means, but it did change the way that people thought about gravity. So the downside of progress. Not all scientific gains were used for peaceful means. Chemicals, metallurgy, and electrical marvels were used for the military as well. And at this time, competition between Great Britain and Germany was sharp, and they were trying to get their hands on chemicals and metals and new electrical marvels. Most people didn't expect the military competition to lead to an all-out war, because the balance of power had been kept by the alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had set up to keep peace in Europe. Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber synthesized ammonia from nitrogen in the air in 1909. This made it possible for nitrogen fertilizers to dramatically increase food production in the world, and for that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, a few years later, in 1915, using sort of the same concepts, he developed poisonous gas against the advice of his wife and many of his scientific colleagues. His wife was also a scientist, and actually the first woman to earn a PhD in science. When this gas was first used, 5,000 people died and 10,000 people were injured, and Haber's wife shot herself. He continued to make it secretly after Germany lost the war, despite international treaties that forced them to disarm. International role reversals. So, technological innovation revealed the deficiency of traditional nations. India, China, Latin America, and even the Ottoman Empire were all examples that the technological innovation that was taking place in the West would cause significant decline in these places. In India, in particular, technological progress in one location caused desolation in another. As the factories grew in Great Britain, the handweavers in Italy were impoverished and put out of business. Indian indigo farmers were displaced by Germans. Alfred Kahn Bayer determined the chemical structure of indigo, and his company made it available commercially, and so they were producing it at a much quicker rate than the Indian indigo farmers were, so they were displaced by Germans. The Indians grew increasingly bitter at the British. The British at this point still had pretty much direct control of India. So it was almost like they were putting their own colony out of business in some respects. In China, so in October of 1911, there was a bomb in China that went off in the Wuhan area that triggered a series of army mutinies and civilian revolts. And within a month, the Manchu government, or the Qing dynasty, created a civil constitution and convened a provisional national assembly. And so this guy named Yuan Shikai, who was a powerful military leader, was elected premier, sort of like president. And the boy king at the time had to abdicate the throne. But instead of starting a republic like Yuan Shikai was supposed to, he named himself emperor, and this provoked a widespread revolt. He actually died the next year, and China entered a decade ruled by warlords, pretty much. And so revolutionaries were looking to a guy named Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen had three principles. One was nationalism. He wanted the people in China to unite together under the banner of China against foreign control. And the first thing he wanted them to do was to oust the Manchus. The Manchus, or the Qing dynasty, had come from Manchuria. So he wanted to get rid of them first. The second one was democracy, and he wanted a government based on the Western model, a separation of powers, republicanism. And the third one was that he wanted new technology in China. He wanted railways and waterways and communication so that China could catch up with the West. Sun Yat-sen didn't really adhere to Marxism or communism, but he did believe that the state should control the industries. This is more like socialism. Because he believed there was a complete lack, and there was a complete lack of production in China. Sun Yat-sen was revolutionary, but he really was never afforded the opportunity to implement his plans. He did later inspire Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, though. So Latin America. The British and the Americans began investing in Latin American industry. And so they would put forth the capital or the money in order to kickstart industrialization in Latin America. And basically foreign and technological innovations were initiated, and it resulted in foreign profits. Most of these technologies were farming and mining technologies, but there was lots of money to be made in that. Latin America during this time was mostly ruled by caudillos, and these were like military dictators, pretty much. And they treated their nations like they were their own personal estates. Control and patronage was what mattered. And money and profits were only a means to an end. And that end was power. They wanted more and more and more power. And of course, not everyone was content with caudillo rule. There was a new group of businessmen who began to think of new goals. They wanted better education, more industrialization, more independence from foreign investors like the Americans and the British, more consistent government with democratic involvement. And the European immigrants who moved to Latin America in the late 1800s brought these ideas about industrialism and workers' rights and labor unions and politics and things like that. So looking at the Mexican Revolution, the years for this are 1912 to 1920. And this was a major armed struggle that radically transformed Mexican politics and society. And it started when their president, Porfirio Diaz, who had ruled for 35 years, basically failed to find a way to choose the next president. There wasn't a succession plan, which led to a crisis among the competing elites who wanted to become president. And so this gave opportunity for insurrection. Okay, so lots of names here. Francisco Madero. Francisco Madero had been cheated out of the 1910 presidential election, and he revolted under the plan of San Luis Potosi. And so under this plan, Diaz's presidency was declared illegitimate. Madero was named provisional president, and the plan called for democracy and demanded the return of lands that had been unjustly taken from Mexican villages by Diaz. So this armed conflict lasted, again, for the better part of the decade until around 1920. And over time, the revolution changed from a revolt against established order under Diaz to a multi-sided civil war where a bunch of different groups rose up, and they were all asking for different things. There were constitutionalists who wanted a constitution. There were people fighting with Northerner Pancho Villa, who turned out to be really nothing more than a bandit. And then a peasant leader, Emilio Zapata, who opposed Diaz's regime and led the fight for land reform in Mexico until his assassination in 1919. There was even a group of conservatives led by a guy named General Victoriano Huerta, who wanted to reimpose the old order, but revolts in the north prevented them from doing so. And so it really was just people fighting in round after round of bloody civil war. So at the end of all of this fighting, the constitutionalists came out on top with a military victory, and Carranza became the pre-constitutional president of Mexico. And I'll put his name up here so you can have it for your notes. So then they wrote and ratified a new constitution in 1917, and he was elected the constitutional president. And then in 1920, when the elections were to be held, Carranza attempted to impose a civilian as the leading candidate for the presidency. And so he brought General Alvaro Obregón to the presidency. So managing political succession was finally achieved in 1929 with the creation of, we'll just go with the PNR, but it's the Partido Nacional Revolucionario. There we go, I said it. And this was a political party that has dominated Mexico since its creation. It's now called the Institutional Revolutionary Party. But the thing to remember about this is that it started because there was no clear line of succession, and it ended when they finally came up with a line of succession thanks to the PNR. And I know this video is getting long, but we're almost done. The Ottoman Empire. So unlike Mexico, the Ottomans did retain economic autonomy or self-rule. And unlike India, they did not lose their sovereignty. But like China, they did lose many of the attributes of self-rule, even though they stayed formally independent. And this was all because the Ottomans could not keep up technologically with the West, and so they slowly disintegrated. They were called the sick man of Europe. And despite attempts at reform, the empire was defeated by the Russians in war in 1878, which was a humiliating defeat for them. And then in 1881, European bankers complained because Ottomans were defaulting on their loans, and they demanded that Europeans be placed in the Ottoman treasury. And Europeans also gained the right within the Muslim Ottoman Empire to defend the rights of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And they even placed Christian representatives from each denomination in Constantinople to make sure those rights were being allowed. Despite this, Ottomans continued to launch attacks on Armenian Christians committing genocide. You may have heard of the Armenian genocide, but they killed 200,000 of them in 1895. In 1908, there was an attempt to westernize or modernize the Ottoman Empire. And there was a group of Turkish progressives, mostly made up of professors and army officers, called the Young Turks. That is important. I would write it down. The Young Turks. And they seized control of the government. Despite the changes that they wanted to make, the empire was still picked apart. And they pretty much lost their remaining European and North African holdings. They lost Bosnia to the Austrians. They lost Albania, Bulgaria, Liberia, and even some islands in Africa. By 1914, when World War I started, they were weakened so badly that they couldn't even keep peace in their own region. Because, of course, under the Ottomans, there were many different ethnic groups, different religions being represented, and they were failing to keep the peace. So we will go ahead and bring our video to a close here.